Welcome to Chapter 9, Non-Tariff Barriers to Imports. If you recall from the chapter on tariffs, tariffs effectively protect domestic producers against the competition coming from imports. Non-tariff barriers do exactly the same. So they clearly help those that are domestic producers, and it harms the domestic consumers of the products because it effectively is a tax and therefore raises the price. It probably hurts the importing nation as a whole because of that. So if you remember, the consumer surplus lost is not offset by the producer surplus gained. And it almost surely hurts the world as a whole. So we come in this chapter to discuss not tariffs, but alternatives to tariffs which countries implement. And the way in which we think of these is to collect them all together, all the alternatives to tariffs that do restrict trade, as non-tariff barriers, or NTBs. So international economists talk about NTBs, and what it means is anything that's stopping trade from occurring freely that's not a tariff. So it's any policy used by the government to reduce imports other than the simple tariff. And the NTB reduces imports through one or more of the following direct effects: by obviously restricting the quantity of imports, increasing the cost of getting those imports into the country, into the market concerned, and creating uncertainty about the conditions under which imports will be permitted. The first of these is probably the obvious one. Rather than increase the price to reduce the quantity, we can just put a quantity restriction on the amount of imports. Essentially, this is the same as a tariff, as if you remember, the tariff restricts the amounts of imports. So for every tariff, there is an equivalent quota. So a quota is really just restricting the amount of imports, which automatically is going to raise the price. You would think that, as the tariffs give revenue to the government, that governments wouldn't necessarily like quotas because they're just fixing a quantity and they're not getting any revenue directly from it. But some governments do this. It ensures the quantity of imports is strictly limited, and it also gives government officials greater power. So it puts more power in the hands of government officials, as you will see in a second. So the effects of a quota, as I've said, are the same as really a tariff in terms of the overall welfare effects. In other words, consumers lose consumer surplus of A plus B plus C plus D in the diagrams that we had in the previous chapter. Areas B and D are losses to the country. They're the efficiency losses. The area C, which was the tariff going to the government, now it's called an import markup revenue. So it's the difference between the world price and the domestic price for each of the units imported. Obviously, the producers also gain producer surplus, the domestic producers, that is. So, focusing in on that area C, how do we decide on who gets area C? Well, obviously the government decides, because it's government who implements the quota. But the way in which the government does that really determines who gets the area, the rent, if you like. So there are three main ways in which the government does this, and they're listed here: fixed favoritism, auction, and resource using procedures. So let's look at each of these in turn. Fixed favoritism. Here the government allocates the licenses to importers using some kind of rule or process that involves no resource costs. So in other words, there's some kind of arbitrary rule which decides, who is going to get the import quota and who is not going to get the import quota. So there's no real competition involved here, applications or negotiations. basically, and that's what it's called, favoritism here. The firms, are allocated these licenses, and they get that area C. By the way, this is the way it tends to work in Japan. So there are strict import quotas for various types of produce into Japan, and Japan effectively hands out licenses, most of it done for political favors, or a lot of it done for political favors. Auction, one way in which the government can kind of maximize that revenue, if you like, from, instead of doing a tax, is to try and get the firms to compete against each other. Now, in theory, no firm, the sum of what the firms pay in terms of the auction prices that they pay shouldn't come to anything more than that area C. But in this case, that area C, just like with a tariff, goes back to the government. So this is an equivalent way of charging a tariff, if you like. You do a quota and you basically auction the import licenses to the highest bidder, obviously, and then that maximizes the revenue as far as the government is concerned. Shouldn't, in theory, be any more than that area C, though. Resource using procedures. So instead of fixed favoritism or an auction, the government can insist that firms that want to acquire licenses must compete for them in some way other than price. So resource using application procedures include things like allocating these quota license on a first come first served basis. So maybe there'll be a quota and the government will say, well, the first to apply gets whatever they want. On the basis of demonstrating need or worthiness. So if there's a quota there, you've got to demonstrate that you need to import this particular product. And you have to demonstrate that to the government, or on the basis of negotiations with the government. This typically happens, by the way, in developing countries. So those seeking the licenses use resources to try and get them. So in other words, the companies concerned might have to befriend and take the officials out for meals in order to get those import licenses. You can imagine that this is probably a way in which some bribery goes on as well. Some of that area C is likely to be a loss to the country, though. Why? Because there might be bribery at stake, in which case it goes to the official concerned. It doesn't go to the government to be redistributed for some government spending project, etc. elsewhere. Now, he calls this rather odd-looking trade barrier. This is like a quota that works in reverse. So in this case, if the country is thinking of doing an import quota, then oftentimes it might negotiate with the country that is the main exporter of the product concerned and say, look, rather than us putting a quota on the product, can you voluntarily restrain the amount of exports you do, which basically amounts to restraining the amount of imports that we handle. And so a VER, or a voluntary export restraint, is a trade barrier in which the foreign exporting country agrees to limit its exports to that importing country. And usually what that then entails is that the exporting country conducts an auction for licenses to export to the importing country. Now you're probably thinking, who the heck would do that? Well, in fact, this is the main way in which exports of vehicles from Japan to the US takes place. The US decided that it didn't want to put a tariff on exports of vehicles from Japan that were then imported to the US because they wanted to maintain good relations with the Japanese government and try and encourage the Japanese government not to retaliate for any restrictions on imports into the US. So they said to the Japanese government, look, we won't gain any benefit from this, but we want to limit your competition to give our manufacturers a chance, and therefore we'll ask you to do voluntary export restraints. And the Japanese said, okay, we'll do that. So that's what limits the amount of Japanese vehicle imports into the US. So that Area C is then captured not by the domestic government in terms of things like import licenses, but it's captured by the foreign government as like an export license. So that's completely lost to the importing country in this case. There are other types of non-tariff barriers as well. These are more subtle. Product standards are a famous way in which countries stop competing imports. The famous one that I've heard here is Sweden. As many of you know, Volvo is a Swedish vehicle manufacturing company. Volvo is now owned, I believe, by Ford, but prior to its takeover by Ford, it was headquartered and based and independently based in Sweden, in Stockholm, just outside Stockholm. So the Swedish government wanted to kind of give some kind of advantage within Sweden to Volvo. So what it did, and this is back in the 1970s, is it decided that because of the bad weather, Sweden's in Scandinavia, that the rules, the product standards on all vehicles in Sweden should be that they have a little windshield wiper over the front headlights. So in other words, when it's snowing in Sweden, they have a little wiper that wipes the headlights. On all cars, that had to be the case. Now, it just so happened that Volvo was the only manufacturer that had that on its vehicles. So what it meant is that any other vehicle manufacturer who wanted to sell vehicles in Sweden had to produce a special version of the vehicle that had these little mini windshield wiper things over the front headlights. So that's a good example of product standards. So that's a form really of non-tariff barriers for product standards there. That's probably the most interesting example I can give you off the top of my head. Secondly, domestic content requirements. These requirements mandate that a product produced or sold in the country must have a specified minimum amount of domestic production value in the form of wages paid to local workers or materials produced within the country. The best example of that is Japan with cell phones at one point. At one point, Japan specified that you had to have a certain amount of content for any cell phone sold in Japan. That obviously favored the domestic producer of cell phones, which was Sony. That's since been dropped, but that was the case. So when the iPhone first came out, it was very difficult to get it in Japan because none of the domestic providers of cell phones could provide iPhones at the time. That changed though. Government procurement. Many governments decide that they want to give preference to their own firms, so firms that are domestic firms, rather than throwing open the door and allowing foreign firms to compete. So that's really a way in which domestic firms can push up their prices, of course, and it's a form of non-tariff barrier. So ending up this first part of the chapter, how big are the costs of protection? Well, the net national loss as a percentage of GDP, you can work this out by saying net national loss as a percent of GDP is equal to half times the tariff rate times the percent reduction in imports times the import value over GDP. So that's the formula that can be used. Now, of course, this national loss as a percent of GDP is likely to underestimate the true cost of the tariff for the following reasons. First of all, when you impose a tariff, often it's the case that the foreign country retaliates, that is, imposes their own tariff. maybe on the same product, possibly on a different product. So at the moment, for instance, an example of that is President Trump decided to impose tariffs on European vehicles coming into the country. In response, or has threatened to, in response, the Europeans have threatened to impose tariffs on some of our products, and etc., etc. And that can get out of control. It can spiral out of control, with the US then imposing tariffs, and then the EU then imposing another set of tariffs, etc. That certainly has been the case in China in recent years as well. The true cost of the tariff as well doesn't cover enforcement costs. Remember, if it's a tariff or a non-tariff barrier, like a quota, someone's got to, impose the tax, collect the tax, do all the administrative work relating to that. If it's a quota, someone's got to count the number of imports, make sure that it fulfills the legislation that the government's passed relating to those imports. The rent-seeking costs. That is that, for instance, the costs of if you're going to try and obtain a license, for instance, to import, or obtain a license to export, if it's a VER, then you've got to go through the costs of knowing who to contact in the government, knowing how the auction system works, etc. So there's costs involved there. Rents to foreign producers. That can be the case if you impose a VER, for instance. Then obviously that area of the welfare, or that welfare area, goes to a foreign producer or foreign country. Also, the higher price tends to, in the domestic market, tends to reduce the amount of innovation. It means foreign firms don't have to worry too much about the competition. They already have a higher price. They're already making supernormal profits. They're already doing very well, thank you. We don't need to worry too much about foreign competition here because it's limited. That's the end of the first half of this chapter. Thank you.